Elliot Spitzer wrote an article in Slate magazine talking about the influence that comptrollers and treasurers can have on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, particularly their obstructionism with climate change legislation. And he said the public pension funds should pressure the board to drop the chamber membership, the board of a corporation. If one activist state comptroller begins to build this coalition, then other state pension funds will follow. Do you agree or disagree with that? Is that a role that you're willing to take on as treasurer with the pension funds?
I'd want to read his piece in its entirety,
Sure.
and I'd be happy to read it and react to that specific thing, because sometimes you hear a sort of a summary of it, and I'd like to read it.
Sure.
But if you're asking about the role of a treasurer or controller to be more of an activist,
Mm-hmm.
let me give you an example that I am familiar with, and that's say on pay. That's the say on pay legislation, the Barney Frank piece of legislation. I think the treasurer of the Commonwealth, and specifically Steve Grossman, if I become treasurer, is going to use that bully pulpit far more aggressively than it's been used in the past. Mm-hmm. What do I mean by that? When the average CEO in America makes 500 times, and obviously you measure it differently, but makes 500 times what the average worker makes, when that gulf between those at the top, the CEOs, and those who work in those companies, is at levels that we have never seen before, I think, in the history of this country. When corporate executives are getting huge compensation packages, benefits and perks, perhaps without the performance justifying it, then I think as a treasurer, I am going to stand up at board meetings, at stockholders meetings, excuse me, not board meetings, but at stockholders meetings, and vote our values. Because this is what our values are all about. Now, is it ironclad, and how much of an impact will it have? Hard to know, because the legislation was written in a way that was more advisory than anything else. Mm-hmm. But if you have an opportunity, after all, we own about $55 billion of pension assets in this Commonwealth, roughly. It varies depending on what the stock market is doing. And a lot of those are in common stocks, not all of them, but a lot of them. So the treasurer has tremendous influence, potentially, if he or she decides to use it. And I think you've got to be very careful as to when you step in and when you don't. But when it comes to things like being an activist treasurer and saying, no, I think the CEO of this company is earning excessive compensation, I don't think it's right, I don't think he or she has earned it, and I'm voting against it, that may not cause the company to behave in a different way, but it certainly sends a message to compensation committees and to outside directors, to the society at large, to business writers, to bloggers, to all kinds of people who study this behavior of corporations at a time when corporate behavior, shall we say, is not always particularly attractive, that these practices are no longer acceptable. And they shouldn't be acceptable to the people of a Commonwealth when it's state public pension funds that are invested and are involved. So voting your values and using that power, using that clout, is something that I believe in. Elliot Spitzer's recommendation, I'd want to take a look at that. It may very well fit in that same category, but being an activist in terms of how our values are promoted. And if companies don't behave in a certain fashion, then it seems to me we have an obligation to potentially decide whether or not we want to continue to own those common stocks. If companies continue to do business in Darfur and continue to help the regime engage in genocide and kill hundreds of thousands of people, we shouldn't be investing in those companies. And I know we have legislation that says we can't do that anymore. But that kind of role, I think, is a role that the treasurer should take on. Not in every situation, but in situations where our values are at stake and where our public pension funds can be used to make a strong statement. And by the way, I don't think it costs us any money in the long run. If a company is divested and we invest in another company, the chances are we'll find another company whose values are ones that we are more attuned to, which is going to do just as well. Mm-hmm. So for those who put barriers in the way, I reject that argument. Mm-hmm. And I think you can be a good fiduciary, and I think you can be sensitive to return on investment and still always be sensitive to the progressive values that got me into this business called political life many, many years ago.
Okay.
Great.